There is a version of you that exists only in the space between what happens to you and what you do next. That space is small. Sometimes it lasts a second. Sometimes it lasts less than that. But everything you have ever regretted, every relationship you have damaged, every opportunity you have lost, every version of yourself you are ashamed of was born in that space. Because you let something else fill it instead of you. You let the anger fill it. You let the fear fill it. You let the panic, the jealousy, the humiliation, the grief fill it. And you became a passenger in your own life for exactly as long as it took that emotion to burn itself out. And then when it was over, when the damage was done, the real you came back, looked around, and had to clean up the mess that the emotional version of you left behind. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. This is biology. And it has been happening to human beings since before we had language to describe it. But here is what almost nobody tells you. That space between trigger and reaction. The one that feels like it disappears the moment you need it most can be trained. It can be widened. It can be claimed. And the people who seem unshakable, the ones who stay calm while everyone else is losing their mind. The ones who respond instead of react are not wired differently than you. They have simply learned to live inside that space instead of being swept past it. This is what this is about. Not suppressing what you feel. Not becoming cold or detached or pretending you are fine when you are not. Mastery is not the absence of emotion. Mastery is the presence of choice inside emotion. It is the difference between a wave crashing over you and a wave you learn to surf. Both are powerful. Only one destroys you. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why your emotions hijack you the way they do. What is actually happening inside your brain and body in those moments. And more importantly, you will have a complete practical system for taking back control. Not someday, not after years of meditation retreats. Starting with the very next moment that tests you. Because here is the truth you already know somewhere inside yourself. You are not going to stop having intense emotions. Life is not going to stop throwing things at you. The question was never whether you would feel anger, fear, humiliation, or grief. The question is whether those feelings will run you or whether you will finally learn to run them. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Why Emotions Rule You. Right now, before you can master your emotions, you have to understand why they master you in the first place. Because right now, for most of your life, they do. Not because you are undisciplined, not because you lack character, because your brain was built over hundreds of thousands of years to prioritize survival over composure. And it has not caught up to the fact that the threats you face today are rarely the threats it was designed for. Deep inside your brain, buried beneath the layers responsible for language, planning, and reasoning, sits a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons called the amygdala. Its job is simple and ancient. Scan the environment for danger, and if it finds any, act immediately before the thinking parts of your brain even have a chance to weigh in. This system kept your ancestors alive when a rustle in the grass might have meant a predator. It does not ask questions first. It does not consult your values, your goals, or your long-term plans. It simply floods your body with chemicals designed to make you fight, flee, or freeze. And it does this in a fraction of a second faster than conscious thought can move. The problem is that your amygdala cannot tell the difference between a lion and a difficult email. It cannot tell the difference between a genuine threat to your life and a comment from a stranger online. A raised voice from someone you love, a mistake at work that dents your pride to that ancient part of your brain. All of these register the same way. Danger, danger, danger. And so it responds the same way it always has, by hijacking your body before your rational mind is even in the room. This is what neuroscientists call an amygdala hijack. And once you understand it, you will start to recognize it everywhere in your own life. Your heart rate spikes. Your breathing becomes shallow and fast. Blood is redirected away from your digestive system and toward your muscles, preparing you to physically fight or run. Your vision can narrow. Your hearing can change. And critically, blood flow to your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for reasoning, impulse control, and long-term thinking, actually decreases. You are quite literally becoming less intelligent in the moments you most need to be wise. This is why you have said things in anger that you would never say calm. This is why you have made decisions in fear that you would never make with a clear head. It is not that those decisions reflect who you really are. It is that in those moments, the part of you capable of reflecting anything at all had been temporarily taken offline by a system designed for a world that no longer exists in the way it once did. Understanding this changes everything, because it moves the problem from a question of character to a question of mechanism. You are not broken. You are running ancient software on a modern operating system. And that software was never updated to distinguish between a predator and a passive-aggressive text message. Once you see it this way, the shame starts to lift and something more useful takes its place. Curiosity and the beginning of control. Here is the second piece of the puzzle. And it matters just as much as the first. Every time you go through an emotional hijack and let it run the show, you are not just having a bad moment. You are reinforcing a neural pathway. The brain operates on a simple principle. Neurons that fire together wire together. Every time anger leads to yelling, every time anxiety leads to avoidance, every time humiliation leads to lashing out, you are strengthening the connection between that trigger and that response. You are training your brain without meaning to keep doing exactly what you wish it would stop doing. This is why old patterns feel so hard to break. It is not because you are weak. It is because you have unknowingly been practicing them sometimes for decades. But this cuts both ways. And this is where your power begins. If repetition built these automatic reactions, repetition can also rebuild new ones every single time you catch yourself in that gap between trigger and reaction. Even if you only manage to slow down for a single breath before you respond, you are weakening the old pathway and building a new one. You are quite literally rewiring your own brain one moment of awareness at a time. This is not metaphorical. This is how neuroplasticity works. The brain you have today is not fixed. It is a living, adapting structure shaped by what you practice. And starting right now, you are going to start practicing something different. There is one more thing you need to understand before we move forward, because it will save you from a trap that catches almost everyone who tries to work on this. The goal is not to stop the amygdala from firing. You cannot do that, and you would not want to if you could, because that system also protects you from real danger. And connects you to real joy, real love, real meaning. The goal is not to eliminate the alarm. The goal is to change what happens after the alarm goes off. The lion is not the enemy. Losing yourself the moment you hear it roar. That is the enemy, and that is something you can absolutely change. Think about the last time you were hijacked in this way. And I want you to actually think about it, not just skim past the idea. Maybe it was a conversation that escalated faster than you meant it to. Maybe it was a wave of panic before a decision that in hindsight was not nearly as dangerous as it felt in the moment. Notice that in the aftermath, once the chemical storm had passed and blood flow had returned to your prefrontal cortex, you almost certainly saw the situation differently. You may have felt embarrassed by how you handled it. You may have thought, that is not who I am. That is not how I wanted to respond. This gap between the person who reacted and the person who later evaluated that reaction with clearer eyes is the exact gap we are going to close throughout the rest of this. Not by eliminating the hijack, which is not possible, but by shrinking the distance between the you who reacts and the you who reflects, until eventually they become close enough to be the same person most of the time in most moments that matter. It also helps to understand why some triggers feel disproportionately intense compared to the actual situation in front of you. Very often, a present moment trigger is not really about the present moment at all. It is about every similar moment that came before it, stacked invisibly underneath the current one. A raised voice from a partner might trigger a reaction far bigger than the specific comment deserves. Because your nervous system is not only responding to this one sentence, it is responding to every time raised voices meant danger earlier in your life, going all the way back to childhood in many cases. This is why some triggers make you feel like you have gone from zero to fully overwhelmed in a heartbeat, with seemingly no proportion between the size of the event and the size of your reaction. You are not overreacting to the sentence in front of you. You are reacting to every sentence like it that came before, all landing on you at once. Understanding this does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does explain it. And understanding is the first ingredient of change, because you cannot recalibrate a response you do not understand the true size of. Chapter 2. The Mastery Mindset Shift. If you take nothing else, take this. Emotional mastery is not the same thing as emotional suppression. And confusing the two will not just slow your progress. It will actively work against you and cause damage you will have to repair later. This distinction is so important that we need to sit with it before we go any further, because almost every wrong turn people take on this path starts with getting this one thing backwards. Suppression is when you push a feeling down, refuse to acknowledge it, and act as though it does not exist. It looks like control from the outside. The person seems calm, nothing shows on their face. But inside, the emotion has not gone anywhere. It has simply been denied a voice. And emotions that are denied a voice do not disappear. They go underground and they resurface later, usually at a worse time, in a worse way. Often aimed at the wrong target. The colleague who never says anything is difficult until they explode over something small. The partner who insists they are fine right up until the resentment leaks out sideways in sarcasm and distance. The person who buries grief under constant busyness until it finds them anyway, in their sleep, in their health, in a moment they least expect. Suppression is not strength. It is delayed cost with interest. Mastery is something else entirely. Mastery means you feel the full weight of the emotion. You let it move through your body honestly. And yet you retain the ability to choose your response rather than being dragged by it. Mastery says, I am furious right now, and I am also the one who decides what happens in the next 60 seconds. Mastery says, I am terrified and I can still take the next right step. This is a radically different relationship with your inner life than most people have ever been taught, because most of us were raised with one of two broken models. Either we were told to suppress, to be strong, to not cry, to get over it, to keep a straight face, or we were given no framework at all and simply left to be swept along by whatever we felt, calling that authenticity, when really it was just the absence of a skill nobody ever taught us. There is a third way, and it sits between those two extremes. Think of your emotions as messengers, not masters. A messenger arrives at your door carrying urgent information. Anger is a messenger telling you a boundary has been crossed. Fear is a messenger telling you something matters and might be at risk. Sadness is a messenger telling you something valuable has been lost. Shame is a messenger, however clumsy and unwelcome, telling you something about how you see yourself in relation to others. Every single emotion you feel is carrying information that matters. The mistake most people make is one of two things. They either shoot the messenger and refuse to hear what it came to say, which is suppression, or they let the messenger walk straight into the house, sit down at the head of the table, and start making every decision from that point forward, which is being ruled by emotion. Mastery means you open the door. You listen to what the messenger has to say. You thank them for the information, and then you, not them, decide what happens next. This reframe matters because it gives every emotion, even the ones that feel ugly or embarrassing, a legitimate reason for existing. You stop needing to fight your own nature. You stop wasting energy being angry at yourself for feeling angry or ashamed of feeling ashamed, which is a trap that keeps so many people stuck in an exhausting inner war they never asked for and never needed to fight. The moment you stop treating your emotions as the enemy, you free up an enormous amount of energy that used to go toward resisting yourself. And you can redirect all of it toward the actual skill of responding well. There is a practical test you can use to know whether you are practicing mastery or slipping into suppression, and it is worth remembering because it will guide you through every chapter that follows. Ask yourself, am I aware of what I am feeling right now, or am I avoiding looking at it? Mastery always begins with honest awareness. You cannot direct what you refuse to name. If you find yourself claiming you are fine when your body is tense, your jaw is tight, and your mind is replaying the same thought on a loop that is not calm, that is a lid pressed down on something that is still very much boiling underneath. Real mastery has a different quality to it. It is not the frozen stillness of a lid held down by force. It is the settled stillness of a lake after the wind has passed through and been allowed to move on. This is also where a lot of people get discouraged early, because they expect emotional mastery to feel like emotional absence. And when they still feel the anger, still feel the fear, still feel the sting of the insult, they assume they have failed. You have not failed. Feeling it is not the failure. Losing yourself to it, that is the only failure that matters here. And even that is not really a failure. It is simply information about where your practice still needs to go. From this point forward, every single tool you learn is built on this foundation. You are not trying to feel less. You are training yourself to feel fully and still choose wisely. That is the entire game, and it is a game you can absolutely learn to win. Chapter 3, The Pause. If emotional mastery has a single foundational skill, one technique that everything else in this practice is built on top of it is this, the pause. Not a complicated technique, not something that requires years of training to access. Just a pause deliberately placed between the moment something happens to you and the moment you respond to it. And yet this simple act, this brief refusal to react on autopilot, is the single most powerful tool you will ever develop for taking control of your inner life. Remember what we covered earlier. In the middle of an emotional hijack, your prefrontal cortex, the reasoning, deciding, choosing part of your brain goes quiet while the older, faster, more reactive parts of your brain take over. The entire purpose of the pause is to buy enough time for your prefrontal cortex to come back online before you say or do something that the reactive version of you will regret. That is it. That is the whole mechanism. You are not trying to eliminate the emotional surge. You are trying to outlast its most dangerous, most impulsive opening seconds long enough for the wiser part of your brain to rejoin the conversation. Here is what almost nobody tells you about this. The physiological peak of an emotional reaction. The moment where the flood of stress chemicals is at its most overwhelming typically lasts somewhere between 90 seconds and a few minutes if you do not feed it with more thought. This is sometimes called the 90 rule. And while the exact number can vary from person to person and moment to moment, the underlying truth holds. Emotion left alone is not actually endless. It rises, it peaks, and if you do not pour fuel on it by rehearsing the story, replaying the insult, imagining the confrontation, it begins to fall. Most people never discover this because they almost never let an emotion simply run its course without acting on it or feeding it. They speak while the wave is still cresting, and then they are shocked by what came out of their own mouth. So how do you actually create this pause in real life, in the middle of a real conversation, a real conflict, a real moment of pressure when everything in you wants to respond immediately? The first and most reliable tool is your breath. Because breath is the one part of your nervous system's alarm response that you can consciously control. When you feel the first spark of a strong emotion, the tightness in your chest, the heat rising in your face, the tension in your jaw, that is your cue. Not to react but to breathe. A single slow breath in through the nose for a count of 4, held for a count of 4, released slowly through the mouth for a count of 6. Sends a direct signal to your nervous system that the danger is not immediate, that you have time. This is not a trick or a placebo. It works because your breath and your nervous system are directly linked, and slowing one measurably slows the other. The second tool is physical distance when you have the option to use it. If you can, and often you can, even if it does not feel like it in the heat of the moment, step away. Say you need a moment. Walk to another room. Step outside. This is not avoidance. And it is not weakness. It is one of the most mature moves available to you because it removes you from the immediate stimulus that is feeding the reaction, giving your body and mind the physical space to reset. The people who insist on resolving everything the instant it happens, who refuse to ever say, "Let's talk about this later," are often the ones who cause the most damage. Not because they care more, but because they have confused urgency with importance. The third tool, and one of the most powerful, is a simple internal phrase you can train yourself to reach for automatically. This feeling is information, not instruction. Say it to yourself silently. The moment you feel the surge begin, it sounds almost too simple to matter, but the act of naming what is happening, even in this small way, activates the very part of your brain that the emotional hijack was suppressing. You are in that moment reminding your prefrontal cortex that it still has a seat at the table. Here is what this looks like in practice. In the kind of moment that used to run you over completely, someone says something that lands like an insult. In the old pattern, your mouth would already be moving before you had time to think. The words already halfway out before any part of you had signed off on them. In the new pattern, you feel the exact same spark of anger, the exact same heat. But instead of speaking immediately, you take that one breath. You let a beat of silence sit in the space where a reaction used to live automatically. In that beat, you are not doing nothing. You are doing the most important thing you can do. You are giving the wiser version of yourself time to arrive. This will feel unnatural at first, even uncomfortable because you are working against years, sometimes decades of automatic wiring. And the automatic pattern will not disappear just because you understand it intellectually. It disappears through repetition, through choosing the pause again and again in small low-stakes moments first until it becomes available to you in the moments that matter most. Start small. Practice the pause when someone cuts you off in traffic. Practice it when a minor inconvenience irritates you. Build the muscle in low-stakes situations, so it is strong enough to hold when the stakes are high. Because make no mistake, the pause is a muscle. And like every muscle, it grows through use, not through understanding alone. There is a specific kind of resistance you will run into as you practice this. And it is worth naming ahead of time, so it does not derail you when it shows up. Part of you will insist that pausing means losing, that the person who reacts instantly, who fires back immediately, is the one who wins the moment. This is one of the oldest and most convincing lies that intense emotion tells you. In the heat of it, speed feels like strength. But look honestly at your own history and you will very likely find the opposite pattern. The moments you are proudest of, the moments where you handled something with real strength, were rarely the fastest reactions. They were the ones where you found a way to slow down just enough to respond from a place of clarity rather than combustion. Immediate reaction is not strength. It is simply speed, and speed without direction has never once been the same thing as power. It is also worth saying plainly that the pause is not about becoming passive, and it is not about letting people walk over you while you silently breathe and count to 4. This is a common fear and a reasonable one because many of us learned early that staying calm meant staying quiet, meant swallowing our own needs to keep the peace. That is not what is being asked of you here. The pause does not remove your right to speak up, set a boundary, or respond with real force when real force is genuinely called for. It simply relocates the source of that response from the reactive hijacked part of your brain to the deliberate chosen part of your brain. You can still say the hard thing. You can still hold the boundary firmly. You can still walk away from something unacceptable. The difference is that you will be choosing to do it rather than being swept into it. And a boundary you consciously choose to hold will almost always be stronger, clearer, and more sustainable than one you stumble into out of pure emotional reflex. Chapter 4. Naming the emotion. Once you have created a pause, once you have bought yourself even a few seconds of space between what happened and how you respond, the next skill is deceptively simple. And yet it is one of the most scientifically validated tools for emotional regulation that exists. It is this. Name exactly what you are feeling as precisely as you can in words, either silently to yourself or out loud. This might sound almost too basic to matter. Surely just saying "I feel angry" cannot do very much on its own. But researchers who study the brain during emotional experiences have found something remarkable. The simple act of putting a feeling into words measurably reduces activity in the amygdala, the same alarm system responsible for the hijack we talked about earlier, while increasing activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for reasoned thought. This effect has a name in psychological research: affect labeling. In plain language, it means that naming a feeling begins to tame it. Not eliminate it, not suppress it, but genuinely reduce its intensity and its grip on you simply by turning it from a raw physical sensation into a piece of language your rational mind can work with. There is an intuitive reason this works, even beyond the neuroscience. When an emotion is unnamed, it tends to feel enormous, formless, and total, as though it has swallowed the whole of your experience. It is not anger. It is everything. It is the whole moment. It is you. But the instant you name it, you create separation between yourself and the feeling. "I feel humiliated" becomes a sentence about something you are experiencing rather than a total identity you have become. This distinction between "I am furious" and "I feel furious right now" seems small, but it is not small at all. One statement fuses you with the emotion completely. The other creates just enough distance for you to remember that you are the one having the experience, not the experience itself. Here is how to actually practice this in a way that goes beyond the surface level and gives you real power over what you are feeling. Most people, when they try to name an emotion, reach for the closest, most obvious word available. Mad, sad, stressed, upset. These words are not wrong, but they are blunt instruments. And blunt instruments give you limited leverage. The real skill lies in getting specific instead of mad. Is it frustration? Is it resentment? Is it humiliation? Is it betrayal? Is it a sense of being disrespected instead of sad? Is it grief? Is it disappointment? Is it loneliness? Is it a sense of loss for something you never even had the chance to have? The more precisely you can name what you are feeling, the more information you extract from the messenger. And remember, every emotion is a messenger carrying something you need to know. This precision matters practically, not just philosophically, because different emotions call for different responses. Generic anger might tempt you to lash out at whoever is nearest. But if you slow down and discover that what you are actually feeling is not anger at your colleague but humiliation at having your competence questioned in front of others, that is entirely different information, and it points toward an entirely different useful response, perhaps a private conversation about how feedback is delivered rather than a public argument that solves nothing and damages a relationship you will need tomorrow. There is a second layer to this practice that deepens it even further. Naming not just the emotion but its intensity on a simple scale you set for yourself, perhaps 1 to 10. This is not about turning your inner life into a spreadsheet. It is about giving yourself another small moment of observation rather than immersion. Asking yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense is this right now, forces a kind of mental step back that is almost impossible to do while you are still fully submerged in a feeling. You cannot rate something from a place of total fusion with it. The very act of rating it requires you to stand slightly outside it. And that slight distance is exactly where your power to choose lies. There is one more thing worth knowing here, because it will save you from turning this practice into another form of avoidance. Naming an emotion is not the same as analyzing it to death or using clever language to talk yourself out of feeling it at all. The goal is not to intellectualize your way past a feeling so thoroughly that you never actually feel it. That is simply suppression, wearing a more sophisticated disguise. The goal is brief, honest acknowledgement. This is what I am feeling. This is roughly how strong it is. And now I can choose what to do about it. It should take seconds, not minutes. A quick, precise check-in, not an extended interrogation. Practice this in the small moments of your daily life, not just the dramatic ones. Because like the pause, This becomes far more available to you under real pressure once it has become a habit under low pressure. Notice when you are mildly irritated in traffic and instead of just feeling generically annoyed, ask what it actually is. Impatience. A sense of being delayed from something that matters to you. A small loss of control over your own time. Notice when you feel a flicker of envy scrolling through other people's lives online. And instead of letting it sit as vague discomfort, name it honestly. This is envy. This is a signal about something I want for myself. The more fluent you become at naming small emotions accurately, the more this skill will be there for you automatically when the stakes are far higher in the moments that used to run you over completely before you ever had the chance to choose. Chapter 5, The Physiology Reset. Everything we have covered so far has worked primarily through the mind pausing, naming, creating space for the rational brain to come back online. But there is another entire dimension to emotional mastery that most people overlook completely. And it may be the most immediately powerful tool in this entire practice because it works directly on the body. And the body, as it turns out, has just as much influence over your emotional state as your thoughts do, if not more. Here is something that surprises most people the first time they truly understand it. Emotion is not just something that happens in your mind and then shows up in your body as a side effect. It is a two-way street. Your thoughts influence your body. Yes, but your body also directly influences your thoughts and your emotional state in real time. And this means you can intervene on your emotions not only by working with your mind but by deliberately changing your physical state, and the effects can be almost immediate. Let's start with the tool you already have with you at all times. Your breath. We touched on breathing briefly when we discussed the pause, but its role here goes much deeper because breath is not just a way to buy time. It is a direct lever on your entire nervous system. Your body has two major branches of what is called the autonomic nervous system. One is the sympathetic branch responsible for the fight, flight or freeze response. The one that floods you with adrenaline and cortisol when your amygdala sounds the alarm. The other is the parasympathetic branch responsible for rest, digestion, and calm. Sometimes called the rest and digest system. These two systems cannot be fully active at the same time. When one is dominant, the other recedes. And the fastest, most reliable way to shift from sympathetic dominance, that racing heart, that shallow, panicked breathing, into parasympathetic dominance, calm, settled, clear-headed, is through slow, deliberate, extended exhalation. This is why techniques like box breathing, inhaling for 4 counts, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, holding for 4, or extended exhale breathing where your out-breath is deliberately longer than your in breath, work so reliably across cultures across centuries long before anyone had the language of the nervous system to explain why. When you breathe slowly and deliberately, especially when you extend your exhale, you are directly stimulating something called the vagus nerve, a major communication highway that runs from your brain down through your chest and abdomen. And stimulating it sends an unmistakable signal throughout your body. It is safe to stand down. This is not a metaphor and it is not wishful thinking. It is measurable. It shows up in heart rate variability. It shows up in cortisol levels, and it is available to you in any moment in any location with no equipment and no permission needed from anyone around you. Breath is not the only physical lever you have. Your posture and physical position matter enormously as well. And the relationship works in both directions. Just as feeling confident tends to make you stand taller, deliberately standing taller. Shoulders back, chest open, chin level, can measurably shift how you feel, even before your mind catches up. This works because your brain is constantly reading signals from your body to help determine what emotional state is appropriate. A body curled inward, shoulders hunched, chest collapsed sends signals associated with threat and defeat. A body that is open, grounded, and upright sends an entirely different set of signals. And in moments of high emotional intensity, deliberately adjusting your physical posture even slightly can begin to shift your internal state. Before you have said a single calming word to yourself, There is another tool worth knowing, one that works especially well for panic, overwhelming anxiety, or emotional flooding so intense that breath alone feels difficult to access. Grounding through the senses. This involves deliberately shifting your attention away from the internal storm and onto immediate concrete physical reality. Notice 5 things you can see around you. Really see them. Their color, their shape. Notice 4 things you can physically feel: the texture of your clothing, the surface beneath your feet, the temperature of the air. Notice 3 things you can hear. This is not a distraction technique in the dismissive sense. It works because intense emotional states, especially anxiety and panic, often involve your mind racing into the future or spiraling around the past. And grounding through your senses forcibly returns your attention to the only place your nervous system can actually find safety, which is the present moment, exactly as it is right now. Cold exposure deserves a mention as well because it is one of the fastest physiological interventions available for extreme emotional flooding. Splashing cold water on your face or briefly holding something cold triggers what is sometimes called the mammalian dive reflex. A physiological response that slows your heart rate and shifts your body rapidly toward a calmer state. It sounds almost too simple. But in moments of genuine emotional overwhelm when your thinking mind feels completely unavailable to you, this kind of direct physical intervention can create just enough of a reset for the other tools in this practice: the pause, the naming, the reasoned response to become accessible to you again. What all of these tools have in common is this: they treat your body not as a passive vessel that simply reflects whatever your mind decides to feel, but as an active participant, a lever you can pull, a partner in the process of regulation rather than a bystander to it. You do not have to wait for your thoughts to calm down before your body can calm down. You can start with the body and let the mind follow. And often this is faster, more reliable, and more available to you in the moments you need it most than any amount of thinking your way through it ever could be. What makes this physiological layer so valuable is that it does not require you to win an argument with your own racing thoughts, which, if you have ever tried it in the middle of real panic or real fury, you already know is close to impossible. Trying to think your way out of an emotional flood while the flood is still at its peak is a little like trying to have a calm, reasoned conversation with someone who is shouting over you. The body-based tools bypass that entirely. They work underneath thought on the actual physiological machinery producing the storm in the first place. Which is exactly why they can create a shift so quickly, often within a minute or two, even when the situation itself has not changed at all. This is also why the people who seem naturally unshakable are very rarely people who simply think differently in the moment. Far more often they are people who knowingly or not have built physical habits that keep their nervous system closer to a regulated baseline to begin with. Regular movement, consistent sleep, exposure to natural light, time spent outdoors. All of these shape your baseline nervous system state long before any single triggering moment ever arrives. A body that is chronically underslept, sedentary, and starved of recovery is a body primed for the sympathetic system to dominate. Which means it takes far less to tip it into a full hijack. A body that is well rested and physically cared for has more room, more buffer, more capacity to absorb a stressful moment without spiraling. In this sense, mastering your emotions is not only something you practice in the acute moment of a trigger. It is something you are quietly building or quietly undermining. In every choice you make about how you treat your body across an ordinary day, hold on to these tools because they are going to matter enormously as we move forward into the chapters that follow, where we will take everything covered here. The pause, the naming, the physiological reset, and begin applying them to the deeper, more entrenched patterns underneath your emotional reactions. The stories you tell yourself in the moment, the specific triggers unique to your own history, and what it actually takes to hold your ground when the pressure is at its highest and everything in you wants to fall back into the old automatic way of responding. Chapter 6. Rewriting the story you tell yourself. Every emotion you feel is preceded by a thought. Even when that thought moves so fast, you never consciously notice it happening, something occurs. And in the space of a heartbeat, your mind assigns it a meaning, tells a small instant story about what it means. And it is that story, not the raw event itself, that produces the emotional wave that follows. This is one of the most important truths in this entire practice because it means the event happening in front of you is only ever half the equation. The other half, the half you actually have influence over, is the interpretation your mind attaches to it before you have even had time to think. Consider two people receiving the exact same piece of feedback from a manager. The words are identical, the tone is identical, and yet, one person walks away calm, motivated, already thinking about how to improve. The other walks away furious, humiliated, replaying the conversation for the rest of the day. What separated them was never the event. It was the story each of them told themselves about what the event meant. One heard, "This is useful information that will help me grow." The other heard, "This is proof that I am not good enough, that I am about to lose everything I have worked for." Same words, same room, completely different emotional outcome because completely different internal narration. This is not a new idea. It has appeared in one form or another across nearly every serious tradition of psychology and philosophy for thousands of years. It is not the event that disturbs us, but our judgment about the event. What is new, or at least newly practical, is understanding that this narration is not fixed. And it is not something that simply happens to you against your will. It can be noticed, examined, and in many cases deliberately rewritten. And this rewriting is one of the most powerful tools available to anyone serious about mastering their emotional life. The challenge is that these stories usually run so automatically, so far beneath conscious awareness, that most people never even realize a story is being told at all. They believe they are simply reacting to reality as it is. Someone was late to meet you and you feel a surge of hurt, and it feels like the hurt is a direct, unavoidable, purely rational response to the lateness itself. But notice the lateness itself is neutral. It is simply a fact. This person arrived after the time you agreed on. The hurt comes from the story layered on top of that fact. Perhaps the story is they do not respect my time, or I am not a priority to them, or this always happens to me. No one ever takes me seriously. None of these stories are stated out loud. They run silently instantly, and they are what actually produces the emotional charge you feel far more than the bare fact of the lateness itself. The skill here begins with slowing down enough to catch the story as it runs. Which is why everything you have learned so far, the pause, the naming, matters so much as preparation for this deeper work. Once you have paused and once you have named the emotion honestly, the next question becomes, what am I telling myself right now about what this means? Not what happened. You already know what happened. What does my mind say it means? This question alone, asked honestly and specifically, will surface stories you did not even realize you were carrying. And many of them, once brought into the light, will not hold up nearly as well as they seem to in the shadows of automatic reaction. Once you have identified the story, the next step is to interrogate it, not harshly, not as an act of self-criticism, but with the curious, almost detective-like question. Is this story actually true? Or is it simply the most familiar explanation my mind reaches for? Often you will find that the story you have been telling yourself is not the only possible explanation for what happened, and frequently it is not even the most likely one. The friend who did not reply to your message might not be avoiding you. They might simply be overwhelmed with something in their own life that has nothing to do with you at all. The critical comment from a colleague might not be an attack on your competence. It might be clumsy delivery from someone who was themselves under enormous pressure and did not think carefully about how their words would land. This does not mean you should always assume the most generous possible interpretation no matter what. That would be its own kind of dishonesty. It means you should recognize that your first story is a guess, not a verified fact. And treating a guess as certain truth is exactly what turns a manageable moment into an emotional flood. There is a specific reframing practice worth building into your regular routine because, like everything else in this system, it becomes far more available under real pressure once it has become familiar under low pressure. When you notice a strong emotional reaction, ask yourself 3 questions in sequence. First, what is the story I am telling myself right now? Be specific. Put it into words, even if only in your own mind. Second, what evidence actually supports this story? And what evidence, if you are honest, contradicts it or leaves room for another explanation? Third, what is a more balanced, more accurate way to understand this situation? One that takes the facts seriously without adding unnecessary catastrophe or unfounded conclusions on top of them. This is not about lying to yourself or forcing false positivity onto a genuinely difficult situation. It is about separating what actually happened from what your mind, often shaped by old wounds and old patterns, immediately assumed it meant. This practice will also reveal something important over time. Certain stories will start to repeat themselves across completely different situations. And when you notice this pattern, pay very close attention because it is showing you something significant about your own history. If you consistently interpret neutral or ambiguous situations as evidence that you are being disrespected or unwanted or not good enough, this is rarely a series of unrelated coincidences. It is far more often a single old wound formed somewhere earlier in your life, wearing a different disguise each time it resurfaces. Recognizing this pattern does not mean the current situation never matters. It might genuinely matter, but it does mean you can begin to separate what belongs to the present moment from what you are carrying forward from somewhere else entirely. And that separation alone can dramatically reduce the intensity of your reaction because you are no longer fighting today's small disappointment with the full accumulated weight of every similar disappointment that came before it. There are a handful of these distorted stories that show up so frequently across so many people's lives that they are worth naming individually because simply recognizing them by name makes them far easier to catch in the moment they arise. One of the most common is what could be called mind readating, where you assume you know exactly what someone else is thinking or feeling about you. Usually something negative without any real evidence beyond your own interpretation. They think I'm incompetent. They're annoyed with me. They don't actually want me here. These stories feel like certainty, but they are almost always guesses dressed up as facts. And testing them against reality, sometimes simply by asking the person directly, dissolves an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering that would otherwise have run unchecked. A second common pattern is catastrophizing, where a single setback is immediately projected forward into a worst-case sweeping conclusion. One critical comment becomes evidence that your entire career is in jeopardy. One difficult conversation becomes evidence the relationship is ending. The mind under stress has a strong pull toward the most dramatic possible interpretation. In part because ancient survival wiring favored assuming the worst over assuming the best. Since assuming the worst and being wrong cost far less than assuming the best and being wrong about a genuine threat. But in modern life, where most of your triggers are not genuine survival threats, this bias produces far more unnecessary suffering than protection. When you notice a catastrophic story taking shape, it is worth deliberately asking, what is the most likely outcome here? Not the worst possible one and not the best possible one either, simply the most realistic one based on everything you actually know. A third pattern worth naming is all or nothing thinking, where a situation is compressed into 2 extreme categories with no room for anything in between. Either I am a good parent or a terrible one. Either this relationship is perfect or it is failing. Either I handled that flawlessly or I completely blew it. Real life almost never actually operates in these binary terms. And yet the mind, especially under emotional pressure, has a strong pull toward this kind of extreme simplification because nuance requires more cognitive effort to hold than a clean, simple verdict does. Practicing the deliberate insertion of middle ground back into your thinking. This was a hard moment, and it does not erase everything good that came before. It is a small act that repeated consistently meaningfully softens the intensity of many emotional reactions over time. Chapter 7. Your personal trigger map. Up to this point, everything covered has applied broadly. Tools that work regardless of what specifically sets you off. But real mastery requires something more personal because your particular triggers, the exact situations, people, tones of voice, and circumstances that reliably knock you off balance are not the same as anyone else's. And generic advice will only take you so far without this deeper layer of self-knowledge. This chapter is about building what we will call your personal trigger map. A clear, honest inventory of exactly what sets you off, why it likely does, and what pattern tends to follow once it happens. Most people move through life being ambushed by their own reactions over and over, as though each instance is a surprise. They feel blindsided every single time, even though if they stepped back and looked honestly at their own history, they would find the exact same handful of triggers appearing again and again in different costumes, in different relationships, in different seasons of their life. The specific person changes, the specific words change, but underneath it is very often the same small set of core triggers repeating themselves endlessly because they have never been clearly identified and understood. Building your trigger map starts with honest reflection on your own recent history. Think back over the last several months and identify the moments where you lost your composure most significantly. The moments you would most like to have handled differently. Do not judge these moments yet. Simply gather them. For each one, ask what specifically was said or done immediately before you felt the shift begin. Not the general situation, the specific moment, the specific sentence, the specific look, the specific tone. This precision matters enormously because vague identification produces vague awareness while precise identification produces genuine usable insight. Once you have gathered several of these moments, look for patterns across them. Very often, people discover that their triggers cluster around a small number of core themes, even when the surface situations look completely different. Some of the most common categories include feeling disrespected or dismissed, feeling controlled or having your autonomy threatened, feeling excluded or unwanted, feeling incompetent or exposed as inadequate, feeling unheard or unseen, and feeling that your safety, whether physical, financial, or emotional, is under threat. Notice which of these themes appears most frequently in your own list. This is not an accident. It points towards something specific about your own history, your own early experiences, your own particular sensitivities. And once you know your specific theme, you gain an enormous advantage because you can begin to recognize it approaching before it fully arrives rather than only recognizing it after it has already taken hold of you. There is a second layer to this mapping that deserves equal attention. The specific bodily sensations that reliably precede your reactions. For most people, there is a physical signature that shows up moments before the emotional wave fully crests. A tightening in the chest, a clenching in the jaw, a heat rising in the face, a sudden coldness in the hands, a specific quality of tension in the shoulders. These sensations are enormously valuable because they function as an early warning system, arriving slightly before the full emotional flood, giving you a small but genuinely usable window to apply the pause before the reaction has fully taken over. Spend time this week simply noticing your own physical signature. The next time you feel even a small flicker of irritation or unease, pause and scan your body. Where do you feel it first? What does it actually feel like? This noticing practiced consistently will sharpen your ability to catch your own reactions earlier and earlier until eventually you are catching the spark before it has any real chance to become a fire. It is also worth mapping the specific people and contexts where your triggers are most active because emotional reactivity is rarely uniform across every relationship and every setting. Many people find they are remarkably composed at work but combustible at home, or endlessly patient with strangers but short-tempered with the people closest to them. This is not hypocrisy, and it does not mean you are a fraud in one setting and your true self in the other. It usually means that the relationships where you feel safest are also the relationships where your guard is lowest and where old unresolved patterns have the most room to surface, precisely because those relationships feel secure enough to survive it. Understanding this can remove a significant amount of shame from the equation. It is not that you are worse around the people you love. It is that those relationships are exactly where your unfinished emotional business tends to surface first. And that is actually useful information, not evidence of some deep personal failing once your trigger map begins to take shape. The real value comes from using it proactively rather than only reflectively before you enter a situation you know has historically been difficult for you. A specific conversation, a specific family gathering, a specific type of meeting. Take a moment beforehand to consciously prepare. Remind yourself of your known pattern. Decide in advance while you are calm what response you want to practice if the familiar trigger appears. This kind of preparation dramatically increases your odds of responding well because you are no longer trying to invent a new response from scratch in the heat of the moment. You are simply executing a plan you already made with a clear head, which is always easier than improvising wisdom under pressure. Chapter 8. Holding your ground under pressure. Everything you have built so far. The pause, the naming, the physiological reset, the reframing, your personal trigger map has been preparing you for this. The moments when the stakes are genuinely high, when the pressure is real, and when the old automatic pattern will fight hardest to reassert itself. It is one thing to practice these skills in a quiet moment of reflection. It is another thing entirely to hold on to them in the middle of a heated conflict, a high-pressure negotiation, a public confrontation, or a moment where something you genuinely care about feels threatened. This chapter is about closing that gap, about making sure the skills you have built actually show up when you need the most, not just when things are calm and easy. The first thing to understand about high-pressure moments is that they are precisely where your training will either hold or collapse, and there is no way to know in advance which one will happen except through deliberate practice under conditions that at least somewhat resemble real pressure. This is why elite performers in every field, athletes, surgeons, pilots, negotiators, spend so much of their preparation time deliberately practicing under simulated stress rather than only practicing the underlying skill in comfortable low-pressure conditions. A skill that only exists when you are calm is not yet a real skill. It is a nice idea that has not yet been tested. The goal from here forward is to take everything you have learned and begin testing it deliberately and gradually under conditions of increasing real pressure so that it becomes genuinely reliable rather than merely theoretical. One of the most important shifts in mindset for high-pressure moments is understanding the difference between reacting to protect your ego and responding to protect your actual interests. Because these two things are very often confused. And the confusion is exactly what causes so much unnecessary damage in moments of conflict. When someone challenges you, criticizes you, or opposes you, there is almost always an immediate pull to protect how you look, to win the exchange, to avoid appearing weak or wrong in front of whoever is watching. This pull feels urgent and important in the moment, but it is very often disconnected from what actually serves your real longer-term interests. Before responding in a high-stakes moment, it is worth asking yourself a direct question. Am I about to speak in order to protect my ego or in order to protect what actually matters here? These are sometimes the same thing, but far more often than people realize they are not. And the answer to this question alone can prevent an enormous amount of damage that would otherwise be difficult to undo. Silence is one of the most underused tools available to you in high-pressure moments. And it deserves specific attention here because it runs directly against nearly everyone's instinct. In the middle of conflict, there is an almost overwhelming pull to fill every silence, to respond immediately to every accusation, to correct every misstatement the instant it is spoken. But silence held deliberately rather than out of fear, communicates something that words very often cannot. Composure, confidence, and control. A pause before responding to a provocation does not signal weakness. Whatever the anxious part of your mind insists in the moment, it signals that you are not being controlled by the provocation. And this alone often changes the entire dynamic of a difficult exchange, sometimes causing the other person to reconsider their own approach without you needing to say a single word. There is also enormous power in a specific kind of honest low reactivity language that keeps you grounded even in the middle of real conflict rather than responding to an accusation or attack with an equally forceful counter-accusation which almost always escalates the situation further. Try responding with clear, calm, factual statements about your own experience and position. I hear that you're frustrated and I want to understand what's actually going on here. This is not about being passive or refusing to stand your ground. It is a very different kind of strength. One that does not need to match aggression with aggression in order to remain firm. Firmness and calm are not opposites. Some of the most immovable, unshakable positions in any negotiation or conflict are held by people who never once raised their voice because their composure itself becomes a form of authority that shouting can never quite achieve. It is also worth preparing specifically for the moments when you know in advance that pressure is coming because anticipated pressure is far easier to navigate than pressure that catches you completely by surprise before a difficult conversation you know is approaching. Take a few minutes to run through what we covered in the trigger chapter. What is likely to trigger you specifically in this conversation? What has triggered you in similar conversations before? What physical sensations you are likely to notice first? And what response you want to practice if that familiar spark appears? This kind of preparation is not overthinking and it is not anxious rumination. There is an important difference between the two. Anxious rumination spirals endlessly without producing anything useful. Deliberate preparation identifies specific concrete points where you are likely to be tested and builds a specific concrete plan for meeting those exact moments with composure rather than reaction. It can also help to build a small set of bridge phrases in advance. Simple, honest sentences you can reach for automatically when a high-pressure moment arrives faster than your composure does. These are not scripts meant to sound rehearsed or robotic. They are simply reliable anchors that buy you a few extra seconds and keep you from filling silence with something you will regret. A phrase like, "I want to respond to this thoughtfully. Give me a moment" does real work in a tense exchange because it openly signals that you are choosing deliberation over reaction without requiring you to have already figured out exactly what to say next. A phrase like, "Help me understand what you mean by that," shifts a charged moment toward genuine clarification rather than assumption, and very often reveals that the situation was never quite what your first interpretation assumed. Having 2 or 3 of these ready in advance, rehearsed enough that they come to mind without effort, means you are never standing completely empty-handed in the exact moment you need them most. It is also worth understanding what pressure does to your sense of time. Because this distortion itself is part of what makes high-stakes moments so difficult to navigate well under real stress. Moments that objectively last only a few seconds can feel enormous, urgent, as though an immediate response is absolutely required right now. This instant or something irreversible will happen. This felt urgency is almost always exaggerated. In the vast majority of real conflicts and high-pressure conversations, a few extra seconds of silence, even a full breath, even a brief acknowledgement that you need a moment to think changes nothing about the actual stakes of the situation. Even though it can feel internally like the difference between control and collapse, recognizing this distortion for what it is, a trick of the nervous system rather than an accurate read of the actual time available to you, makes it considerably easier to claim the extra seconds you need without believing you are failing simply by taking them. Finally, understand that holding your ground under pressure does not mean performing perfect calm no matter what. There will be moments, especially early in this practice, where the old pattern wins anyway, where you say something you wish you had not, where the pause does not come quickly enough, where the wave overtakes you before you can apply any of what you have learned here. This is not evidence that the practice has failed. It is evidence that you are human practicing a skill that took your entire life up to this point to unlearn in the wrong direction. And that will take real sustained time to rebuild in a better one. What matters is not a perfect record. What matters is the trend. The gradual widening of that gap between trigger and reaction. The gradual increase in how often you catch yourself before the old pattern fully takes over. And that trend tracked honestly over months rather than days is where the real transformation actually lives. Chapter 9. The Practice That Never Stops. Every tool covered so far works, but none of them work automatically. And none of them work permanently on the strength of having simply been learned once. Emotional mastery is not a certificate you earn and then carry with you forever afterward. Immune to slipping, it is closer to physical fitness, a capacity that must be actively maintained, that strengthens with consistent practice. And quietly erodes with neglect. This chapter is about building the ongoing sustainable system that keeps these skills sharp for the rest of your life rather than treating everything covered so far as a one-time fix you apply once and then forget. The single most important shift here is understanding that emotional regulation is not something you should only think about in the middle of a crisis. Waiting until you are already flooded, already deep in a difficult moment to try applying a skill for the very first time is setting yourself up for a much harder task than necessary. This is exactly like trying to learn to swim for the first time while already drowning. The skills that actually hold under real pressure are the ones that have already been rehearsed repeatedly in calm conditions until they are available almost automatically. This means your daily practice matters just as much, arguably more than what you do in any single dramatic moment. Build a small consistent daily check-in with yourself. Ideally, at a time that is easy to remember, perhaps in the morning before your day begins or in the evening as it winds down. This does not need to be long or elaborate. A few honest minutes are enough. Ask yourself simply, what have I been feeling today? And have I been naming it honestly or avoiding it? Notice any patterns from your trigger map that showed up. Notice any moments where you successfully paused and acknowledged them, because acknowledging small wins is what makes the larger patterns stick over time. Notice any moments where the old automatic response won instead. And instead of criticizing yourself harshly for it, simply ask without judgment what I might do differently next time a similar moment appears. This consistent low-pressure reflection is what keeps the entire system alive and improving rather than fading quietly back into old patterns the moment your initial motivation cools. Physical maintenance deserves a permanent place in this ongoing practice as well. Because, as covered earlier, your baseline nervous system state is shaped enormously by how you treat your body across ordinary days, not only in acute moments of crisis. Consistent sleep is perhaps the single most underrated factor in emotional regulation that exists. A body that is chronically sleep-deprived has a measurably lower threshold for emotional hijacking. Meaning smaller and smaller triggers become capable of producing full-blown reactions. Regular movement, even simple daily walking, helps regulate the same stress hormones responsible for emotional flooding. Time spent in nature, exposure to natural light, and consistent hydration all play a real measurable role in how resilient your nervous system remains under pressure. None of this is about achieving some perfect wellness routine. It is about recognizing that your capacity for emotional mastery is not separate from your physical life. It is built directly on top of it. There is also enormous value in deliberately seeking out small low-stakes opportunities to practice discomfort. Because a nervous system that never encounters any friction at all tends to become increasingly fragile, reacting strongly to even minor discomforts simply because it has had so little practice tolerating them. This does not mean seeking out unnecessary suffering. It means not automatically avoiding every small discomfort that arises naturally in ordinary life. Sit with mild boredom instead of immediately reaching for a distraction. Tolerate a moment of mild social awkwardness instead of rushing to smooth it over. Allow yourself to feel a flicker of disappointment fully rather than immediately numbing it with food, scrolling, or busyness. Each of these small moments of tolerated discomfort is quietly training your capacity to handle larger discomforts later. In exactly the same way that lifting a manageable weight repeatedly builds the strength eventually needed to lift something far heavier. Community and accountability also matter more than most people expect in sustaining this practice over the long run. It is far easier to maintain a difficult habit when you are not relying purely on your own memory and willpower to sustain it alone. Consider sharing what you are working on with someone you trust. Someone who can gently notice with you when old patterns resurface and celebrate with you when new ones take hold. This is not about needing external validation for basic self-regulation. It is about recognizing that human beings are fundamentally social creatures and that most lasting change happens more easily in connection with others than in complete isolation. However capable you might be of doing it alone. Finally, understand that this practice by its nature never fully concludes. There is no future point where you will have mastered this so completely that no trigger can ever reach you again. Life will keep presenting new pressures, new losses, new circumstances you have not yet learned to navigate. And each of these will at times test you in ways the previous chapters could not fully prepare you for. This is not a discouraging fact. It is simply an honest one, and there is real freedom hidden inside it. You do not need to wait for some future state of permanent unshakable calm before you can consider yourself successful. Success here is not the absence of future difficulty. It is the ongoing consistent capacity to meet whatever difficulty arrives with a little more clarity, a little more composure, and a little more choice than you had the time before. Chapter 10. When mastery slips, no matter how much you practice everything covered so far, there will be moments where it does not work, where the old pattern wins completely. Where you say the thing you wish you had not said, where you make the decision you would not have made with a clear head, where all of your preparation seems to simply evaporate in the heat of a single overwhelming moment. This chapter exists because how you respond to these moments of failure matters just as much as how you respond to the triggers themselves. And for many people, this is the piece that determines whether the entire practice becomes sustainable over years or quietly collapses after the first serious setback. The first thing to understand is that a single slip does not undo the progress you have made. No matter how large or embarrassing it feels, in the moment it happens, this seems obvious, stated plainly. And yet, in the actual aftermath of losing your composure, it rarely feels obvious at all. It feels instead like proof that nothing has really changed. That all the practice was somehow fake. That the old version of you was the true version all along, and every moment of progress before this was simply an illusion that has now been exposed. This reaction, understandable as it is not accurate. And believing it will cause far more damage than the original slip itself, because it tends to trigger exactly the kind of harsh self-judgment that makes people abandon a genuinely valuable practice entirely right at the moment they most need to continue it. There is an important distinction worth making here between guilt and shame, because they are often confused and they lead to very different outcomes. Guilt says I did something that did not align with my values and I want to repair it and do better. Shame says I am fundamentally the kind of person who does this. There is something wrong with me at the core. Guilt held honestly is useful. It points toward repair, toward accountability, toward genuine growth. Shame, by contrast, tends to be paralyzing. And worse, it often produces exactly the behaviors it claims to be criticizing. Because a person who believes they are fundamentally flawed has very little motivation to keep practicing a skill. They have already privately concluded they are incapable of mastering. When you slip, and you will, aim firmly for guilt rather than shame. Acknowledge specifically what happened. Acknowledge its impact if it affected someone else, and direct your energy toward repair and toward learning rather than toward a harsh global verdict about your own character. Repair itself deserves specific attention because how you handle the aftermath of a slip, particularly one that affected someone else, often matters as much to your relationships as the original moment did. A genuine specific apology, one that names exactly what happened and takes real responsibility for it without excessive self-flagellation or excusing, does far more to rebuild trust than most people expect. I lost my temper earlier and the way I spoke to you was not fair. I am sorry and I am working on this. Communicate something powerful both to the other person and to yourself that a slip is not the end of the story. That accountability is possible and that the relationship and your own ongoing growth matter more than protecting your pride by pretending nothing happened. There is also real value in treating every slip as data rather than only as failure. Once the immediate aftermath has settled, once any necessary repair has been made, return to the practice with genuine curiosity rather than continued self-criticism. What actually happened in the moments leading up to this? Was there a specific trigger from your map that appeared? Was there a physical signal you missed or ignored? Were you already depleted from lack of sleep? From an already difficult day? From stacked stress that had been building before this particular moment even arrived? Every slip examined honestly and without harsh judgment contains genuinely useful information about where your practice still has room to grow. And treating it this way transforms what could be purely discouraging into something that actually strengthens your system going forward. It is worth saying directly that the goal was never and is not now perfect emotional control in every single moment for the rest of your life. That goal is not only unrealistic, it is not even desirable. Because a life with zero emotional slips would likely be a life lived far too cautiously, far too guarded to ever fully engage with everything that makes life worth living in the first place. The goal has always been a meaningful, measurable shift in how often the old pattern controls you versus how often you were able to meet your emotions with awareness and choice. And a shift like this is built not through a flawless record, but through returning again and again with patience rather than punishment every single time the old pattern reasserts itself. This willingness to return without giving up, without collapsing into shame, without deciding the entire effort was pointless because of a single difficult moment is itself one of the deepest expressions of the mastery this entire practice is built around. There is one final refrain worth carrying with you specifically for the moments after a slip because it changes the entire emotional weight of the setback. Instead of measuring yourself against some imagined version of a person who never loses composure at all, measure yourself against the version of you from before you began this practice. Ask honestly, would the old version of me have caught this at all? Would the old version of me have recovered this quickly? Would the old version of me have repaired the damage this directly or simply let it fester unspoken for days? Almost without exception, when people ask themselves this question honestly, they discover real measurable progress. Even inside a moment that felt at the time like a total failure, growth in this area was never going to look like a straight line rising cleanly upward. It looks like a general upward trend threaded through with real setbacks. And learning to see the trend clearly rather than fixating on each individual dip is what allows people to keep practicing long enough for the trend to become undeniable. Chapter 11. Mastering Anger. Of all the emotions we experience, anger tends to cause the most visible, most immediate damage. Because unlike sadness or fear which often turn inward, anger is built to move outward, to push, to confront, to defend. This makes it uniquely dangerous to leave unmastered and uniquely powerful once it is genuinely understood and channeled. Well, this chapter takes everything covered so far and applies it specifically to anger because anger deserves particular attention. Not because it is worse than other emotions, but because so few people have ever been taught how to work with it honestly. The first thing to understand about anger is that it is almost never a primary emotion. Beneath nearly every experience of anger sits something more vulnerable, something that feels riskier to expose: hurt, fear, humiliation, or a sense of powerlessness. Anger tends to arrive as a kind of protective covering over these softer, more exposed feelings. Because anger feels active and strong, while hurt and fear feel passive and weak, at least to the part of you that learned somewhere along the way, that vulnerability was dangerous. This is why anger so often shows up disproportionately large compared to whatever triggered it. The size of the anger is rarely about the size of the triggering event. It is about the size of the more vulnerable feeling hiding underneath it and the amount of protective force required to keep that vulnerable feeling from being seen by others and often even by yourself. This insight changes how you should approach anger the moment you feel it rising. Instead of asking only "what am I angry about," which keeps you on the surface, ask a second deeper question. What am I actually afraid of or hurt by underneath this anger? Someone cuts you off in traffic, and the anger that follows is rarely really about the few seconds lost. It is often connected to a deeper sense of disrespect, of not being seen, of your safety being treated carelessly by someone else. A partner forgets something important to you, and the anger that follows is rarely really about the forgotten detail itself. It is often connected to a deeper fear that you do not matter enough to be remembered. When you locate the softer emotion underneath the anger, you gain access to a much more accurate, much more useful understanding of what actually needs to be addressed. And very often addressing the real underlying feeling resolves the anger far more completely than simply venting the anger itself ever could. This does not mean anger itself is something to be ashamed of or immediately suppressed the moment it appears. Anger, like every emotion covered in this practice, is a messenger carrying real information. And in the case of anger, that information is almost always related to a boundary. Anger tends to arise specifically when something you value, your time, your safety, your dignity, your fairness, has been crossed or threatened in some way. This is genuinely useful information. The goal is not to eliminate this signal. The goal is to receive it clearly and then choose a wise, proportionate response rather than letting the raw intensity of the signal dictate your behavior without any filtering at all. There is a particular physical quality to anger that is worth understanding because it behaves somewhat differently from other emotions in terms of how it moves through the body. Anger tends to produce a significant surge of physical energy, a genuine readiness to act. Sometimes described as a feeling of heat or pressure that seems to demand immediate release. This is precisely why unexpressed anger can feel almost unbearable to sit with, and why so many people feel an overwhelming pull to say something, do something, release the pressure immediately, regardless of whether that release is wise. Understanding this physical quality means recognizing that anger genuinely does need an outlet. Suppressing it entirely and pretending it does not exist is not a sustainable long-term strategy. But the outlet does not have to be the person or situation that triggered it. At least not in the first raw moment. This is where physical discharge becomes an especially valuable tool specifically for anger, more so than for most other emotions. Because anger produces such a significant surge of physical energy, moving your body vigorously, even briefly, a fast walk, a set of push-ups, even simply squeezing your hands into fists and releasing them repeatedly can genuinely help discharge some of that physical intensity before you attempt to respond to whatever triggered it. This is not about avoiding the underlying issue. You still need to address whatever caused the anger eventually. It is about separating the physical intensity of the moment from the actual conversation or decision that needs to happen so that the conversation can happen from a place of clarity rather than from the raw edge of the initial surge. Once the initial intensity has been discharged even slightly, and once you have located the softer feeling underneath the anger, the next step is choosing how to express what needs to be expressed. This is where the distinction between assertive and aggressive expression becomes critical. Aggressive expression attacks the other person, their character, their worth, often through blame, insult, or contempt. Assertive expression states clearly what happened, how it affected you, and what you need without attacking the other person's fundamental worth as a human being. The difference between "you never think about anyone but yourself" and "when this happened, I felt genuinely hurt and disrespected and I need us to talk about it" is enormous. Even though both statements might arise from the exact same underlying anger, the first statement almost guarantees defensiveness and escalation. The second statement, while still direct, still honest, still firm, leaves room for the other person to actually hear you rather than immediately needing to defend themselves against an attack on their character. There is a particular kind of anger that deserves special mention here because it is especially common and especially corrosive if left unrest. Chronic, low-grade resentment, the kind that builds slowly over time through many small unaddressed moments rather than exploding from any single dramatic event. This kind of anger is especially dangerous precisely because it rarely announces itself clearly. It simply accumulates quietly moment after moment until it eventually either erupts disproportionately over something minor or curdles into a kind of permanent bitterness that poisons a relationship slowly rather than all at once. The antidote to this particular pattern is addressing smaller moments of genuine anger honestly and promptly rather than swallowing them repeatedly in the name of keeping the peace. A relationship where minor frustrations are voiced honestly and resolved regularly is almost always healthier in the long run than one where everything appears calm on the surface while resentment quietly accumulates underneath, waiting for the moment it finally becomes too large to contain. It is also worth addressing directly a pattern that many people carry without fully realizing it. A deep discomfort with feeling angry at all, sometimes rooted in early experiences where anger was punished, shamed or modeled in frightening, out-of-control ways. If you grew up watching anger expressed only through yelling, violence, or cold withdrawal, it is entirely understandable that some part of you may have concluded long ago that anger itself is dangerous and that the only safe option is to avoid feeling it altogether. This conclusion, while understandable, creates its own significant problems because an emotion that is never allowed any legitimate expression does not simply disappear. It tends to surface sideways through passive aggression, through chronic irritability that seems to come from nowhere, through physical tension and stress-related illness, or through a slow, quiet withdrawal from people and situations that would otherwise still hold real value. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, the work is not to force yourself into loud dramatic expressions of anger that feel foreign and uncomfortable. It is to gradually build a felt sense of safety around simply acknowledging, even quietly and privately at first, that anger is present and that acknowledging it does not automatically mean losing control the way it may have looked in whatever environment first taught you to fear it. There is a final distinction worth making here between anger as information and anger as ongoing identity. Anger experienced honestly, named clearly and expressed with appropriate boundaries is a healthy, functional part of being human, present in every genuinely close relationship. Every meaningful pursuit of fairness, every act of standing up for something that actually matters. The goal of everything covered in this chapter was never to eliminate your capacity for anger. That capacity protects things in your life worth protecting. The goal was to make sure anger remains a visitor carrying useful information rather than a permanent resident running the household, deciding on its own terms how you treat the people you love and how you move through the ordinary moments of your life. Chapter 12. Mastering Fear and Anxiety. If anger is the emotion that pushes outward, fear and anxiety are the emotions that most often pull inward, contracting your world, narrowing your options and convincing you that danger is both larger and more certain than it actually is. Fear in its acute form responds to an immediate identifiable threat. Anxiety, its close cousin, tends to be more diffuse, oriented toward the future, often attaching itself to threats that are uncertain, possible, or entirely imagined rather than currently present. Both deserve careful attention here because both left unmastered can quietly shrink a life far more than most people realize while it is happening. The first and most important thing to understand about fear and anxiety is that they are fundamentally protective in origin, oriented entirely toward keeping you safe. This might not feel true when anxiety is keeping you awake at 3 o'clock in the morning over something that will likely never happen. But the underlying mechanism is the same ancient alarm system covered earlier in this practice. Simply firing in response to uncertainty rather than only in response to immediate physical danger. Your mind under the influence of this system treats uncertainty itself as a kind of threat. Because for most of human history, uncertainty genuinely was dangerous. Not knowing where the next meal would come from, not knowing whether a stranger approaching was friend or foe. In the modern world, most of the uncertainty you face daily carries far lower actual stakes than your nervous system assumes. And yet, the system has not been updated to reflect this. So, it continues generating the same intensity of alarm for a delayed email response that it once reserved for genuine physical danger. One of the most useful distinctions to make when fear or anxiety arises is between what is actually within your control and what is not. Because a significant portion of anxious suffering comes specifically from spending mental and emotional energy on things that cannot be changed no matter how much you think about them. When you notice anxiety building, it is worth pausing to ask directly, is there anything I can actually do about this right now? If the answer is yes, direct your energy toward that specific action. Because taking concrete action, even a small one, is one of the most reliable ways to reduce anxiety's intensity, since it shifts you from a passive helpless stance into an active engaged one. If the answer is genuinely no, if the outcome is entirely outside your influence, then the task becomes different and considerably harder. Practicing the deliberate release of something you cannot control, redirecting your attention toward what you can actually influence in this moment, which is very often simply how you are choosing to relate to the uncertainty itself. Anxiety has a particular relationship with imagination that is worth understanding clearly, because much of anxiety's power comes from the mind's ability to vividly simulate future scenarios that have not happened and may never happen at all. This capacity for imagination is genuinely valuable in many contexts. It allows for planning, preparation and foresight. But under the influence of anxiety, this same capacity turns against you, generating detailed, emotionally convincing simulations of worst-case outcomes. Simulations so vivid that your nervous system often responds to them almost as though they were actually happening in real time. This is why anxiety can feel so exhausting. You are in a very real physiological sense living through the stress of events that have not occurred. Sometimes repeatedly, sometimes for hours or days at a stretch. A useful practice for working with this specific pattern is what could be called productive worry time. A deliberately bounded period, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes set aside specifically for worrying fully and completely about whatever is troubling you, followed by a clear deliberate return to the present moment once that time has ended. This might sound almost too simple to matter, but it works because it gives the anxious part of your mind permission to be heard, which paradoxically makes it easier to set aside outside of that designated window rather than fighting a constant exhausting battle to suppress worry throughout the entire day. When anxious thoughts arise outside of your designated worry time, you can genuinely say to yourself, I am not ignoring this. I have set aside specific time for it, and gently redirect your attention back to whatever is actually in front of you. It is also worth understanding the specific physical experience of anxiety, because so many of the sensations anxiety produces, a racing heart, shortness of breath, dizziness, a sense of unreality, can themselves become frightening, adding a second layer of fear on top of the original worry. A fear of the anxiety itself. This is an extremely common pattern, and understanding it can genuinely help interrupt it. The physical sensations of anxiety, however uncomfortable, are not dangerous in themselves. They are simply your nervous system's alarm response activating the same fight, flight or freeze mechanism covered earlier. Responding to a perceived threat rather than a genuine physical emergency, reminding yourself of this directly in the moment. This is my nervous system's alarm. It is uncomfortable, but it is not dangerous. It will pass, can meaningfully reduce the secondary fear that often makes an anxious episode far worse than the original sensations alone would have been. The tools covered earlier in this practice, particularly the breathing techniques and grounding through the senses, are especially powerful specifically for fear and anxiety, because these emotions respond very directly to physiological intervention. Extended exhale breathing in particular directly counters the physical signature of anxiety. Since anxiety is fundamentally a state of sympathetic nervous system activation, and slow deliberate exhalation is one of the most reliable ways available to shift toward the calmer parasympathetic state on the other side. Building a consistent practice of these physiological tools applied not only during acute anxious episodes, but as a regular ongoing habit trains your nervous system over time to return to baseline more quickly and more easily, gradually reducing both the frequency and the intensity of anxious episodes as this capacity strengthens. There is one more pattern worth addressing directly, because it is one of the most common and most limiting patterns anxiety produces. Avoidance. When a situation, a conversation, a decision, or an environment reliably triggers anxiety, the most immediate, most tempting response is simply to avoid it entirely. And in the short term, this strategy works remarkably well. The anxiety drops almost immediately the moment the feared situation is removed. But avoidance carries a significant hidden cost that only becomes visible over time. Every act of avoidance teaches your nervous system that the situation was indeed dangerous enough to require escape, reinforcing the very fear it was meant to relieve and making the next encounter with a similar situation feel even more threatening than the last. This is how anxiety, left unaddressed through avoidance, tends to expand over time, gradually consuming more and more territory as situations that were once merely uncomfortable become situations that feel genuinely unbearable simply because they have never been faced. The alternative to avoidance is not reckless, unprepared exposure to overwhelming situations. That approach tends to backfire and can deepen the very fear it was meant to address. The more sustainable alternative is gradual deliberate engagement, facing a manageable version of the feared situation. Staying present through the discomfort using the tools covered throughout this practice and allowing your nervous system to directly experience through repetition that the feared outcome does not actually occur, or that even if some difficulty does occur, you are genuinely capable of handling it. This is how confidence in your own capacity to handle anxiety-provoking situations is actually built. Not through the absence of anxiety, but through direct repeated evidence that you can feel anxious and still move forward anyway, which is an entirely different and far more durable form of confidence than simply waiting for the anxiety to disappear before you are willing to act at all. Chapter 13. Emotional Mastery in Relationships. Everything covered so far has focused primarily on your internal experience. But emotions rarely exist in isolation. And for most people, the moments that test emotional mastery most severely happen inside relationships with the people closest to us, where the stakes feel highest and the history runs deepest. This chapter is about applying everything you have learned specifically to the relational context, because mastering your emotions in private reflection and mastering them in the middle of a real conversation with someone you love are related skills, but they are not automatically the same skill, and the second one deserves direct specific attention. One of the most important shifts to make in relational contexts is recognizing that your emotional reactions and the other person's emotional reactions are constantly influencing each other in real time, creating patterns that repeat themselves across many different conflicts. Even when the surface topic changes completely, many couples, families, and close friendships develop what could be called a reactive cycle. A predictable sequence where one person's response to stress reliably triggers a particular response in the other, which then reinforces the original person's reaction, and so on. Each response feeding the next until a relatively small initial trigger has escalated into a significant conflict that seems to have very little to do with whatever started it. Recognizing your own role in this cycle without needing to determine who started it or who is more at fault is one of the most powerful moves available to you, because you cannot control the other person's contribution to the pattern. But you have real influence over your own, and interrupting your own habitual response is often enough to interrupt the entire cycle. This requires a particular kind of humility that is worth naming directly. The willingness to examine your own contribution to a recurring conflict even when you feel quite genuinely that the other person is more at fault. This is not about taking on blame that does not belong to you. And it is not about excusing behavior from someone else that genuinely needs to change. It is about recognizing that in almost every recurring relational pattern, both people are contributing something. Even if the contributions are not equal, and that focusing exclusively on what the other person needs to change while ignoring your own role entirely keeps you in a position of waiting for someone else to change before your own experience can improve, which is a position with very little actual power in it. Repair is one of the most underrated skills in any close relationship. And it deserves specific attention here, because even people who are actively working on their own emotional mastery will still inevitably have moments where the old pattern wins, where something is said that causes real hurt. What separates emotionally healthy relationships from unhealthy ones is very often not the complete absence of conflict or hurtful moments. That standard is unrealistic for any two humans who spend significant time together. It is the consistent presence of genuine timely repair after those moments occur. A relationship where both people know how to return, Acknowledge what happened and genuinely reconnect after conflict tends to be far more resilient than one where conflicts occur less frequently but are never properly repaired, leaving small wounds to accumulate quietly underneath an increasingly fragile surface calm. Genuine repair involves several distinct elements worth understanding clearly. It begins with acknowledgement, naming specifically what happened without minimizing it and without over-dramatizing it either. It continues with taking responsibility for your own specific part, even if the other person also contributed to the conflict, because owning your own piece cleanly and without excessive qualification is what actually allows trust to rebuild far more effectively than a mutual unresolved standoff over who was more wrong. It includes genuine empathy for the impact on the other person. Not just an acknowledgement of the facts, but a real attempt to understand how the moment landed for them specifically. And it often includes some form of commitment going forward. Not a promise of perfection which nobody can honestly make, but a genuine intention to keep practicing this work which the other person can reasonably expect to see reflected over time through consistent effort rather than through any single perfect conversation. There is also enormous value in learning to recognize when someone else is in the middle of their own emotional hijack, because your response to their reactivity has significant power to either de-escalate the moment or accidentally intensify it further. When someone you care about is clearly flooded, speaking from a place of clear emotional overwhelm rather than their calmer, more considered self, matching their intensity with your own reactive response almost always makes the situation considerably worse. Even when their initial reaction was genuinely unfair or hurtful to you, this does not mean tolerating disrespect or absorbing harmful behavior indefinitely. There is an important difference between staying calm and allowing yourself to be treated poorly, and knowing where that line sits for you personally is important work in its own right. But it does mean recognizing that responding to someone else's flooded state with your own composed presence rather than matching their escalation is often the single most effective way to help a difficult moment resolve more quickly and with considerably less lasting damage to the relationship itself. Finally, understand that emotional mastery within relationships is not a solo project. Even though so much of this practice up to this point has focused on your own internal work, the people closest to you will notice over time as you begin applying these tools consistently. And this creates a genuine opportunity, not an obligation, to invite them into a similar practice alongside you. Whether through open conversation about what you are working on or simply through the quiet, consistent example of a person who is learning to meet difficult moments with a little more clarity and a little more choice than before. Relationships change slowly through many small repeated moments rather than through any single dramatic transformation. And your own steady practice sustained over time has real power to shift not only your own emotional experience but the emotional climate of every relationship you are part of. It is also worth understanding that people tend to bring characteristic patterns into moments of relational stress. Patterns that often trace back to much earlier experiences of closeness and safety, sometimes long before the current relationship even began. Some people, when a relationship feels threatened, move toward increased pursuit, seeking more contact, more reassurance, more immediate resolution, sometimes to a degree that can feel overwhelming to the other person. Others move in the opposite direction entirely, toward withdrawal, needing space and distance to process what has happened before they are able to reconnect, which can in turn feel like abandonment to a partner who is wired toward pursuit. Neither pattern is inherently wrong and neither person is doing something deliberately harmful. But when these two patterns meet without any mutual understanding of what is happening, they tend to intensify each other in exactly the wrong direction. The pursuer pursuing harder as the other withdraws further. The withdrawing further as the pursuit intensifies until both people end up feeling exactly the fear they were each in their own way trying to avoid. Recognizing your own characteristic pattern and naming it openly to the people closest to you can meaningfully interrupt this dynamic before it fully takes hold. Simply saying, "When I feel disconnected, I tend to need some space before I can talk about it." And that is not about pulling away from you. It is how I find my way back to being able to show up well, gives the other person genuinely useful information instead of leaving them to interpret your withdrawal through the lens of their own fears. Similarly, saying when I feel disconnected, I tend to want to talk about it right away, and I know that can feel like a lot, helps a withdrawing partner understand that your pursuit is not an attempt to control them, but simply your own particular way of trying to restore a sense of safety. This kind of open naming will not eliminate the underlying pattern entirely. These tendencies run deep and change slowly, but it transforms a dynamic that would otherwise run silently and destructively in the background into something both people can consciously navigate together. Chapter 14. The Identity Shift. Everything covered up to this point has been about specific tools, specific techniques, specific moments of practice. But there is a deeper shift that happens for people who sustain this work over real time. A shift that goes beyond simply having more tools available and moves into something closer to a change in identity itself, in how you fundamentally see yourself in relation to your own emotional experience. This chapter is about that deeper shift because understanding it and deliberately working toward it accelerates everything else covered in this practice considerably. Most people before doing this work hold an unspoken identity that could be summarized roughly as: I am someone who gets swept away by my emotions. I cannot help how I react. This is just who I am. This identity often feels less like a belief and more like an established, unquestionable fact, simply because it has been true consistently for as long as they can remember. But identities like this, however deeply held, are not permanent facts about who you fundamentally are. They are patterns built through repetition. And like any pattern built through repetition, they can be rebuilt through a different kind of repetition. Deliberately and consistently applied over real time, the shift that gradually occurs through sustained practice moves toward a different identity entirely. I am someone who feels things fully and who also has real choice in how I respond. This is not a small linguistic difference. It represents an entirely different relationship with your own inner life. The first identity positions you as a passenger, someone things simply happen to. The second identity positions you as someone genuinely present and engaged in your own experience. Someone who feels the full weight of what arises without needing to be controlled entirely by it. This shift does not happen through a single insight or a single successful moment of composure. It happens gradually through the accumulation of many individual moments where you catch yourself. Pause and choose each one, adding a small amount of evidence toward a new, more accurate story about who you actually are and what you are actually capable of. This is why the practical work covered throughout this entire program matters so much beyond its immediate in-the-moment benefits. Every time you successfully pause before reacting, every time you name an emotion honestly instead of avoiding it, every time you catch a distorted story and replace it with something more accurate, every time you repair after a slip instead of collapsing into shame, you are not only handling that specific moment better, you are quietly building evidence for a new identity, one moment at a time. Evidence that eventually becomes strong enough to genuinely outweigh the old automatic story that used to feel like an unquestionable fact about who you are. It is worth understanding that this identity shift tends to create a kind of positive momentum that becomes self-reinforcing over time as you begin to see yourself with growing confidence as someone capable of meeting difficult emotions with real choice rather than pure reaction. This new identity itself becomes a resource in future difficult moments when a challenging situation arises. Instead of approaching it with the old exhausted expectation that you will inevitably be swept away, you approach it with a growing evidence-based confidence that you have handled difficult moments like this before and can handle this one too. This confidence is not naive optimism. It is not the assumption that the moment will be easy. It is a grounded trust in your own developing capacity built on genuine remembered evidence rather than wishful thinking. And this kind of grounded confidence measurably changes how difficult moments actually unfold because you enter them from a fundamentally different internal position than you once did. There is also a broader ripple effect worth naming here because the people who genuinely master this work rarely keep the benefit entirely contained to themselves. A person who has learned to meet their own difficult emotions with clarity rather than chaos tends to become often without fully intending it a stabilizing presence for everyone around them. The person others instinctively turn to during a crisis. The person whose calm presence helps de-escalate tension. In a room, the person whose relationships tend to feel safer and more resilient. Simply because they are no longer unpredictable in the way unmastered emotions so often makes people unpredictable. This is not a small side effect. In many ways, it is one of the most meaningful outcomes of this entire practice because emotional mastery ultimately is never only about your own internal experience in isolation. It is about the quality of presence you are able to offer to everyone whose life intersects with yours. Chapter 15. The Life This Builds. We began this by describing a small, easily overlooked space. The gap between what happens to you and what you do next. And everything covered since then has been in one way or another about widening that space, about claiming more and more of it as territory where you rather than pure automatic reaction get to decide what happens. It is worth pausing here at the end to consider what a life actually looks like once that space has genuinely been widened. Once these tools have moved from something you are consciously practicing into something closer to simply who you have become. It does not look like a life free of difficulty, and it was never going to. The situations that once triggered you will likely still arise in different forms throughout the rest of your life because difficulty, loss, conflict, and uncertainty are not obstacles standing between you and a fully lived life. They are simply part of what a fully lived life actually contains. What changes is not the presence of these difficulties, but your relationship to them. The amount of unnecessary suffering you add on top of what is already genuinely hard, and the amount of choice you retain even in the middle of situations that would once have completely swept you away. It looks like conversations that used to end in damage, instead ending in genuine connection. Because you were able to hear what someone else needed instead of only defending yourself. It looks like decisions made from clarity rather than panic. Decisions you can stand behind afterward instead of ones you quietly regret. It looks like relationships that deepen over time instead of slowly eroding under the accumulated weight of unrepaired conflict. Because you have learned not only how to avoid unnecessary damage, but how to genuinely repair the damage that does occur honestly and promptly rather than letting it quietly compound. It looks like a version of yourself you actually recognize and respect in the moments that matter most rather than a version you feel you need to apologize for or explain away afterward. None of this requires perfection, and nothing in this entire practice was ever asking that of you. It requires only what you have already been doing simply by staying with this material all the way to this point. A genuine willingness to look honestly at your own patterns. A genuine willingness to practice something unfamiliar even when it feels awkward or difficult at first. And a genuine willingness to return again and again every single time the old pattern reasserts itself without deciding that a single setback undoes everything you have built. This willingness sustained over months and years rather than days is the entire mechanism through which lasting change actually occurs. Not through some singular moment of transformation, but through thousands of small moments, each one slightly widening that original space between trigger and response until eventually, almost without noticing exactly when it happened, you find that you have become someone genuinely capable of meeting whatever arrives with far more clarity, far more steadiness, and far more choice than the person who began this. The lion will still roar because life will always contain real difficulty, real loss, real moments that test you completely. But you are no longer only the person who reacts the instant it does. You are increasingly also the person standing quietly behind that reaction, watching, choosing, and deciding with real clarity exactly what happens next. That space was always yours. It was simply waiting for you to claim it. And now you know exactly how. Think back for a moment to the very beginning of this, to the description of a life quietly run by whatever feeling happened. To show up strongest in any given moment. A life where the real you had to keep waking up afterward to clean up whatever mess the reactive version left behind. That description does not have to be the story of your future. Whatever it may have been in your past, everything covered across these chapters. The pause that buys you a breath of space. The naming that turns a formless flood into something you can actually work with. The physiology that lets your body lead your mind back toward calm. The honest examination of the stories you tell yourself. The personal map of exactly what sets you off and why. The composure that holds under real pressure. The daily practice that keeps all of this alive. The compassion that lets you recover quickly from the moments it slips. The specific work of meeting anger and fear on their own terms. The deeper relational patterns that shape your closest connections. And finally, the identity shift that turns all of this from a set of techniques into simply who you are. None of it was ever about becoming someone new. It was about becoming more fully, more steadily, more reliably the person you already are underneath the noise. The version of you that was always capable of meeting life with clarity, waiting only for the tools and the practice to make that version available more of the time. This work will not conclude the moment this ends. It begins in earnest. The next time something happens that used to sweep you away completely, the next difficult conversation, the next disappointment, the next moment where the old pattern reaches for the wheel out of pure habit, that moment is coming, likely sooner than you expect. And when it arrives, you will have a choice available to you that was not nearly as available before. Not a guarantee of perfect calm, not a promise that it will feel easy, simply a choice, real and genuine. Sitting quietly in that space between what happens and what you do next. Take it and then take it again the next time and the time after that until claiming that space stops feeling like an effort of will and starts feeling simply like who you have become. One last thing worth carrying with you. Beyond every specific tool covered across these chapters, emotional mastery was never really about becoming calmer for the sake of calm itself. As though stillness were the ultimate goal, it was always in service of something larger. A life you can actually stand fully inside. Relationships you can trust yourself within. Decisions you can make without flinching later at what they cost you. The pause, the naming, the breath, the honest look at your own stories and your own history. All of it exists to protect something that matters far more than composure alone. Your ability to show up again and again as the person you actually want to be, especially in exactly the moments that make that hardest to do. That is what was always being built here. Not a quieter version of you, a truer,